Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Learn Arabic with Me Verbs Lesson 1 series. Today we'll be talking about weak ending and defective verbs in Form 1. Now these terms are synonymous. I just thought I'd put them both in because they come up in different textbooks in different ways. Okay, without further ado, let's go. The introduction to weak ending verbs in Form 1. Weak ending verbs, or defective verbs, have a final root letter in ya or waw, and in the perfect tense these may appear as an alif or an alif maksura, which looks like one of these. But remember from episode 4 that an alif cannot be a root letter, and I'll go into more depth about root letters in due course. But whenever an alif or an alif maksura are present in a verb's perfect stem, much like with hollow verbs, you must look to the imperfect stem, the third person masculine singular, to find the true root letter. And I've put these verbs in a format which I find easiest to understand, but I just thought I'd let you know they may not always be presented in this way. I just think this is the most logical. Okay. Type 1 is what I like to call fa'iya yaf'a verbs. And I've used the letters f, a, and ya to represent the three root letters of this type of the verb in the pattern stated above. So these are verbs like baqiya yabqa, laqiya yalqa, and nasiya yansa, and I've given you the meanings just here. And as you can see, they all have this. So they all have this ya in their perfect and the alif maksura ending in their imperfect. Now, I will use baqiya as an example for this conjugation. So now let's turn to the perfect tense conjugation of a fa'iya yaf'a verb. So we'll focus on the fa'iya side. And as you can see, in the inside left hand, I've presented it on this graph. And I'll just talk you through the way we approach this and how we conjugate it. So if you think of the fatha on the third root letter as the fatha on the third root letter on kataba, where it is not present in the conjugation of kataba, it is not present in this verb form either. Without a fatha on a ya, it becomes a straight e sound. So, for example, think of verb forms which have a sukun on the third root letter of kataba. You have katabtu, I wrote, katabta, you masculine wrote, katabti, you feminine wrote, and so on. So let's take katabtu as an example and bakitu. So can you notice that katabtu, so I'll write it separate with separate letters, katabtu has a sukun on its third root letter. So where there's no fatha on this third root letter, we remain with the sound e in the perfect of a fa'iya verb. So we get bakitu. Quite similarly, we have bakiti, bakita. And this is a good example, bakiyat. If we think of the third person feminine singular, so she writes, of kataba would be katabat. So it retains its fatha on the ba. So that's why we have it here, bakiyat. Now, the reason there is no sukun on the ya in these persons is because they are preceded by kasra, and their sound as an e has to be maintained. And the sukun on a ya is only present when it needs to create a consonantal y sound. And we want to maintain this e sound. We don't want to say bakaitu or for example, bakaitu. We want to say bakitu. That's why there's no sukun there. Now, the third person masculine plural ending takes off the ya, the third root letter, as this would be an unnatural vowel arrangement of a syllable in Arabic. So we can't have two long vowels next to each other without a sukun on one of them, without one of them sounding like a consonant, because that would leave us with 4 vowels in a row, and that does not exist in the syllable structure of Arabic. And if you didn't know about that, watch the previous episode where I go into a bit more depth about Arabic syllable structure. To the imperfect tense conjugation of baqiya. Now, this type of defective verbs always has an alif on its second root letter in the imperfect. So that's really easy. That's a really easy and useful rule to learn because the subsequent two types don't have this rule. So if you see a verb that's baqiya or fa'iya verb, it always retains its alif in every person in its imperfect. Now, all four verb forms which do not have a suffix ending, so think of kataba yaktabu. Yaktabu does not have a verbal suffix. So verbs like that will end in alif maksura in this if they are one of these forms. So yaf'a. So yaktabu, no suffix. So baqiya would go to yabka. And remember this alif maksura, and I explained this in video 1, turns into an alif if the verb takes an object suffix. So, for example, I'm meeting him today, it would be ana alikahu al-yawm. So can you notice that this alif maksura has become a straight alif there? So think of all the non-suffixed verb forms in the imperfect tense. They are the first person singular, first person plural, second person masculine singular, third person feminine singular, the third person masculine singular. Now we've got to talk about the third person masculine plural ending, yabkauna. Now this ends in auna because the sukoon only ever marks the final consonant of a CVC syllable, and that is a very useful rule to remember. So because all syllables in Arabic have to start with a consonant, a sukoon has to be followed by a consonant. So the wow with a sukoon on it becomes a consonantal w sound, which is why you need yabkauna. Now, for the same reason, the second person feminine singular ending, this one, is shortened to tabkaina. Now we come on to the second type, and I would say there are two subcategories of this type of defective verb. They are fa'a yaf'i verbs. So these are verbs like masha yamshi, which means to walk. Now the alif maksura ending in the perfect tense signifies that the third root letter and subsequently the last letter of the imperfect stem is ya, and I'll show you what this means in due course. Now this type of verb retains the fatha on its second radical in the perfect tense as opposed to the imperfect tense for verbs such as baqiya yabka. So let's look at this type of verb in the perfect tense conjugation. Here we are. So we have masha, mashai, mashaya, mashau, mashat, mashata, mashaina, mashaita, mashaitama, mashaitom, mashaiti, mashaitama, mashaitana, mashaitu, mashaina. Now, most of this is what you'd expect, and it's quite easy to remember. The one that normally catches people out is this verb form here, because we would have thought maybe mashait, right? But in Arabic, another rule is you cannot have you cannot have two sukoons on two letters which are next to each other. So you cannot have mashait like this. So Arabic drops this last root letter to get mashat. Every other form should be fairly self-explanatory. Now the only form which is not suffixed in the perfect tense is the third person masculine singular, and that's where we have the alif maksura. In every other form you can see that the ya is present except for this spelling rule, and this spelling rule also translates to the feminine third person dual here. We get mashata instead of mashaita. Now mashau is interesting, and this is due to syllable structure again. So just remember, instead of mashao, with the ya fitted in some way. You drop it to retain the syllable structure. Now we've come to the imperfect tense conjugation. So it's rather the opposite as in like a baqiya verb, because the baqiya verbs retain the fatha on their second radical in the imperfect tense, whereas these types of verbs do not. They have a kasra on their second root letter, except for these following rules. The second person feminine singular are the same, as you cannot have two long vowels together in Arabic. So VV. This does not fit into any syllable pattern. So what I mean by that is this form and this form are the same, even though, think of kataba again. This would be taktubina, right? Ina, and this would be taktubna. So in other words, this form has been shortened so it doesn't have to have two yas in a row, which would be VV, and that doesn't exist in Arabic. So this is why this syllable structure rule is very useful. So this is the only type of form where these two verb forms come out as the same. Now, this also explains that why the second and third person masculine plural endings don't contain the last radical, because the hypothetical iuna ending is shortened to an una ending. So this is these two. So second and third person masculine plural endings. So these two here, they go to una. You drop the last radical because you cannot have a ya and a wow next to each other, because that would be two long vowels, four v's, and that does not exist again in the syllable structure in Arabic. Type 2b, which are fa'a, yaf'u verbs. Now these are verbs like bada yabdu, raja yarju, and da'a yad'u. The alif ending in the perfect stem signifies that the third root letter and subsequently the last letter in the imperfect stem is u. So this alif signifies that the third root letter in the imperfect stem would be a waw. This type of verb also retains the fatha on its second radical in the perfect tense, and it does not retain its fatha on the second radical in the imperfect tense. So this is why I think of the penultimate two types as type 2a and 2b, because they have the same verb endings, except one has the third root letter of a ya and one has the third root letter of a waw. So apart from the third person masculine singular perfect, which ends in an alif instead of an alif maksura like type 2a, this conjugates exactly the same as type 2a verbs. But obviously it has a waw as its last root letter, so I hoped would be rajautu instead of rajaitu, because we keep the right root letter in the right place. But in terms of the voweling structure, it is exactly the same. So she hoped would be rajat, and for exactly the same reason, you cannot have two letters with sukoons on them next to each other in Arabic. So we're gonna look at the imperfect tense conjugation of one of these types of verbs, and we'll have a quick discussion about it. The imperfect tense conjugation of raja yarju. Now, the second and third masculine plural, so these two endings are the same, and the second person feminine singular, so this one, drops its third radical to avoid what we've been discussing earlier, the four vowels in a row. So, as I should mention that usually when verb forms have to shorten vowels to make the syllable structure correct in Arabic, they tend to drop the root letters of a word as opposed to the verb ending. So, for example, this waw in yarjuna represents the una ending of the verb rather than the wow of the third radical. So think of it as dropping its last radical and not dropping the one of the letters of it, the verb ending. So it always retains the same verb suffix. It just drops its root letter, because that did confuse me when I was learning these types of verbs. Very much, and here are my contact details again, and please move on to the next episode.